which comes first, the chicken or the egg? In making a quilt, which comes first, the design selection or the fabric? It's a very fortunate quilter that has both of those decisions made at the same time. I'd like to give you a few guidelines to go by in making that big decision. Consider the block that you're going to put in your whole quilt. For instance, on this Brasstown star block, in one 4-inch square there are 5 pieces. 20 pieces plus 5, you have 25 separate pieces to not only transfer the template to the fabric, to piece together, and then quilt. So this would be a big undertaking to make an entire quilt like this. Always consider how small and how many pieces you have in a quilt. When it comes to the actual fabric selection and your color, why not go to the library and get a couple of books and refresh your memory about the color wheel, the warm colors, cool colors, and your sense of balance. This might help out quite a bit. When you go to your fabric store and buy your fabric, a lot of times I get kidded about the fact that I buy a yard of brown and a yard of blue, and then I come home and cut it up into little tiny pieces in order to re-sew it into one big piece again. Well, you tell your family and friends that that's really fiber art. I think by looking at some of finished quilts will help us as far as completing those guidelines. Let's look at a sampler quilt that Alice Wertman has made. When we look at the overall colors in this, we have a nice feeling. It's not only a feminine quilt, but look at the monochromatic beiges and putty color all going to white and to muslin. I think she's done a fine job of selecting her colors here. It blends very nicely. I'd like to talk about the fact that sampler quilts are a great teaching and learning tool. Why not get it all out of your system right at the beginning? Learn how to work with curves, how to work with diamonds, how to do angles on the sewing machine. The other thing I think that is so nice about this quilt is her lovely double cable design around each one of the blocks. Her sailboat block, look at the wave quilting design that she has done here. I think that she's really done a beautiful job. This is a sampler quilt. Going on to what I refer to as scrap quilts is another great way to use your leftover material. Inez Bird has made both of these quilts, and in town she's known as the quilter, and quite often people will give her scrap material, so I think that works out nicely also. This pattern is all based on the pinwheel, on just one triangle, and your fabric is cut out of either muslin or the brown calico, and then your string quilting reaches out to the points. But this was lap quilted in squares in a block-to-block arrangement, and I think a beautiful spider design. Another quilt that Inez has made is the string quilt, all based on your leftover string material, your rectangles. This was sewn on a square of fabric. Once all the squares had been covered with the leftover, then each block was turned. In other words, one block was going this way and then the next block turned, so that you do get design. See the design that it is happening in the string quilt? Great way to use leftover material. How about a Dresden plate design? Norma Graffing has used all the leftover fabric from making all of her daughter's garments when she was growing up. So this is your sentimental Dresden plate. She has quilted it in an overlapping oval in yellow quilting thread, and I think that looks very nice also. We'll talk later on about the nice scallop design that she's put on the outside, which also picks up the curve of the Dresden plate. In working with your leftover material, don't forget that your yellows and reds will need to be balanced. They really jump out at you, and you have to, once again, stand back and look at your colors. A nice thing to do in your sewing room is to take and put your reds in one bin, your blues in another, your yellows and greens, pre-shrink all of your fabric, and sometimes maybe that certain calico will be the springboard for a whole quilt, something that you've already gotten and is left over at home, and then you can go and select maybe a couple of colors to go with it at the fabric store. If you've got lightweight fabric, for instance the organdy that I used in the back of this vest, sometimes it has to be layered on top of a solid color. You want all your fabrics about the same weight. You don't want some heavier and some lighter in weight. Your denims, save those for a denim quilt. We'll talk about that later. Quite often it's fun to take just a a touch of velvet and mix it with your calico. I think an overall quilt using corduroy and velvet is really too much texture, but in certain little touches, as we're going to see later on today, it is nice to incorporate your velvet. Now, when it comes to making that decision for what I refer to as a theme quilt, you're going to actually be coordinating your fabrics. And in thinking about that, I want to talk about some brown tones. For instance, you go to the store and you've made the decision to make a brown quilt. If you select 4 different brown calicos, I refer to something like this as over-coordinated. It's just too matchety, isn't it? Why not take out one of the calicos, put in a dark color, maybe eliminate another one, and put in a geometric. A geometric would refer to either a small check, a polka dot, or a stripe. All of a sudden, you start getting more interest. And don't forget about your large print. Quite often, some of your large floral designs are handsome with a small calico. I do think it's important to pre-shrink all of your fabrics. I think it softens them for the needle. Look at the rail fence quilt that has been, all the colors have been selected by a group in Landrum, and I think you'll see here a light calico, a blending of gold. I would refer to this as a geometric. You see how there's a repeated pattern, and then also a darker color. Because of the contrast, you can see the overall design that is emphasized. Quite often, you'll notice in certain things, because the blend of these 2 shades are so close together, the point on your star really won't even show up. You've got a nice star point here, but in this case, you almost needed a darker color next to that burnt orange, don't you, to bring out the point on the star. So keep that in mind when you're selecting your fabrics. You can see here also, in this color contrast, we have a good selection from the blue versus the more putty colors. Notice a little geometric thrown in next to the calico. Adds interest to your design. Don't forget about the 2-color quilt. I think quite often just navy blue and red can add a nice interest in this sawtooth star. We actually have red on red, we could call that, couldn't we, with a red calico next to the red. But look how that star jumps out at you. I think it's very nice. When it comes to working with our denim, we're going to look later on about the fact that the actual block itself was quilted with embroidery thread, but then the quilt is simply tie-tacked. But this is a great idea for, say, a son going away to college, and you don't want to spend a lot of time quilting, but you want something to keep him warm and use all the leftover denim. I want to show you how to make a nice liner for a basket to carry all of our quilts along in. All of our tools and our small piecework is just great to have this basket all lined, because then we don't lose our needles and our pencils. You're going to make yourself a liner by simply measuring the midpoint on the side of your basket all the way around to the midpoint over here. You're going to want to know the middle of your basket also. I simply take a piece of newspaper, and you want to decide on how much of a fold you want. The fold is going to keep your liner in place, and that way you don't really have to attach any kind of a bow or a tie here. Decide on how much you want to overlap. You can see this is coming around each to the side, and then when you reach down underneath, this reaches to the center of your basket. This is the fold, and you're going to place this on the fold of your fabric and cut it out. I think the diagram here really explains how you can see the fold of your material. That's the bottom of your basket. This is the side. You're going to machine stitch on each side. Then, once you've machine stitched, and you can see, I like to use pre-quilted material. It really is nice. It works perfect in this sort of a situation. Machine stitch, then you come, and I like to pin this first and make a large dog ear or a big triangle that's going to fit in the bottom of your basket. Machine sew across, and that just adds weight and adds depth right in the bottom of your basket, and do that on each side. You might want to pin and test it first to make sure it works. But I think that's a great way to line a basket. Look at even the little ones you can do. And here's your little basket liner, your pattern. Decide on how much you want to come over. You can see this goes all the way around to the center. You can either put some binding around the outside of the quilted material, or even a little touch of rickrack would be fine also. Some quilted material even comes reversible, so that this would be, you could reverse this to the green, or you could use it with the print on the outside. But this was a hand-woven basket, and I really feel I'm preserving and saving the basket by lining it. You could also take your material and line the material also. This one has a complete lining on it. Why not go uptown and take brown velvet and place inside a basket? This is simply a fruit basket. We're going to talk a little bit, and I want to demonstrate at the machine how you could incorporate velvet with your calicos. I don't think this would be the idea for an entire quilt, but quite often you'll want to sew with velvet or perhaps corduroy. And I have done some research and investigating and found out that this little mechanism called an even feed foot is available on just about all the name brand sewing machines. And quite often we were scared to use something like this because it looks like one of those big rufflers, and we'll say, oh, it just won't work. I have found this to be the answer to so many things that I'm doing on the sewing machine. Let's go to the machine, and I want to show you how this works. Before we attach the even feed foot, I'd like to show you an option in working with geometric figures that are repeated quite often in the same quilt. For instance, the rail fence design that the Landrum group is working on, they could take their 2-inch by 6.5-inch rectangle and cut it out 64 times because they've got their 4 colors. Or an optional way to work this would be to go ahead and sew a whole band together of the 4 coordinating colors. Then they could simply cut it apart. Let's refresh our memory just a minute about the 12-inch pattern. We know that we're working with actually 4 6-inch squares, or if we consider the 1/4-inch seam allowance added on all 4 sides, our master template would be a 6.5-inch square. We would then go back to our breaking this 6 inches up into 4 equal parts, our 1.5-inch by 6.5, but once again we've got to add the 1/4-inch seam allowance. So this is what we're working with. We know the width is going to be 2 inches. Now, how long a band are we going to have to cut? If we know that there are 16 of these different squares in each one of these large sections, let's take 6.5, which is the length, times 16, which is going to come out to 104. Let's divide that by 36, which is going to equal 2.888. So we know in this particular section, if we would sew a band that would be 3 yards long and this wide, we would be all set to cut those apart and then rearrange them into the design that we want. The same thing would work with the Roman stripe design. Once again here we are taking, this is a basic 9 patch, so we are working with our master template. Here would be a 4.5-inch section, wouldn't it? And these would be 4.5-inch long strips. We would take our template, the perfect width, and sew our long band like this, and then recut those to turn them into our decorative top. Here's the green and the gold and the blue sewn together. It's important, of course, to measure the length of your basket. It's just fortunate that the 12-inch works perfectly on these baskets that I'm working with, but I have had to add extra length in order to cover the whole top of the basket. Let's turn to the sewing machine and get a chance to see how this even feed foot goes on. We want to first, of course, take off the existing foot that you have on the machine. And that'll just readily come off. And then there are 2 notches that the even feed foot is going to work into. And usually they'll just slip right in, but you've got to make sure that it's attached on this mechanism, the needle arm also. Your threads go at the back. Then I have this partially sewn together, and I'm going to turn on this end, and because of this foot I can readily sew the velvet and the calico together. This also works very nicely with your plaids also. Quite often I have found in sewing fabrics with a nap to them that I want to push back with my left hand, but when I'm using this even feed foot, it just automatically takes care of that. I think you will really enjoy using this mechanism for your machine. Once you've got your strips sewn together, then you can refer to your master template again, and of course this is a good way to see if you're on target. Once you line this up, you can see if you're 6.5 inches wide, and then you know that you're ready to go on, that it's going to come out to the width you wanted. I would take either your piece of soap or your marking pencil and divide these into your sections. You can just keep going right down the line. Each 6.5 section will then be cut apart, and of course then you're going to alternate these and re-sew them together to make your decorative top. Now whether or not this is going to go for a basket top or a whole quilt, depending on the length of the bands you're going to sew together. I'll get 3 cut out, and I can at least alternate them and show you the design that I have chosen here. I have 2 more that were already cut, and so we could put the dark out and then turn like so. And then we're going to alternate this. We can just play with this and decide the exact way you want to go, something like that, or you could have more of the rail fence design with the continuing of the brown. It just depends on which way you want to go. But sew that together for your top, and in this case I needed to add an extra 2 sections, didn't I? All right, I have decided on the lining, the backing, or actually the lining, and I've cut out some batting too, and I've basted that together. You can see my basting threads right there. I have sewn and cut a double ruffle that's on the bias of the same print material that has the stripe in it. I've attached that to the front, and of course the ruffle is falling towards the inside. Each one of the corners I have pinned that ruffle in place. Quite often we get that bulk that's caught up in the corner, so you want to make sure and pin that. Leave an opening large enough to invert that in a few minutes, and then you machine stitch all the way around, and of course I'd use my even feed foot again. Once that has been done, I'm ready to make the inversion, and I haven't really decided if I'm going to quilt this or not. I might quilt just a couple rows where the calico is. I have found that quilting really doesn't show up in your velvet. Anytime you have something with a nap, it really will not show up. Once you've turned this inside out, you're going to have to pull your pins out at the corners. Where are they? And then just give that a little pull and see how that'll come out to form your each corner. Come all the way. Keep coming. I have gone ahead and sewn 2 little brown pieces of velvet ribbon, which I think helps a lot to secure that to your basket. Then I would slip stitch the opening closed, and then you can see how that's simply going to fit right into your basket. And I think the ruffle is really necessary. You might want to use eyelet also, but the ruffle is really necessary because you see how that weights and hangs over your basket. Wouldn't these make nice Christmas presents for all your relatives? Then take the brown velvet and tie a little bow here. And what's nice is that as you're using this and carrying all your quilting in it, you can simply flip it back as a lid would be, and you can reach in and get your items. But that's your little rail fence basket liner and your decorative top. I want to speak on the fact that it's so important to take time to plan your quilt. Let's move some of our things out of the way here. I work quite often on a drafting board and have found that in just about all the quilts I'm doing now, if I would get the general idea of how they're going to work on paper, it more or less not only gives me an overall scheme, but I can figure out how much fabric I'm going to need, and as I finish each section I can kind of check it off, and I can get more of an idea of how fast I'm going on my quilt. The blue and putty colored quilt that I'm working on, you can see that I have drafted the 18-inch squares into more or less a star design on the graph paper, and even though it's based on more or less the log cabin idea of light versus dark, I'm also going to create a star in this pattern. I knew that it was going to turn out square and that I needed to add extra length at each end, so I've already designed the borders that will go on the end also. If you get that far, then why not even type out exactly what you're going to need as far as cutting out how many blues, how many putty color, and it's a good way just to have a plan ahead of time. As far as the amount of fabric that you're going to need in a quilt, I think there are so many books and magazines on the market that you can turn to that will act as guidelines for you. It takes about 6 yards for the back of a double quilt, so that you know if you're having, for instance, 4 blue colors, I would divide that amount by 3, of course, and that would give you more or less an idea of how much yardage you need to buy at the store. When in doubt, buy an extra yard. It's terrible to run out. These magazines, and Quilter's Newsletter is one of my favorites, have so many guidelines, ideas for new quilts, mail order places to order fabrics. If you're frustrated because you can't find the fabrics you want, there are good addresses in all these magazines to refer to. I want to complete the show with a gallop and grin session, and I need to kind of explain what gallop and grin means. Quite often when we're putting our blocks together, we'll study the intersections and we'll say, oh my, that's really almost there. It's not quite, and you have to stop and think, would you see it on a galloping horse? So that's how we've come across our, and of course that makes us laugh. So we call this, it's like show and tell, but it's also gallop and grin. Let's go over to the quilts and gallop and grin. Betty Turner from Winston-Salem has done a marvelous quilt that is entitled Chinese Puzzle. I've never seen this design before, and it's reminiscent once again of the 2-color system in using a quilt selection of fabric, and also just one template, one rectangle. So you can imagine the calculating, well, I'm not sure our calculator would go this high, that we would be figuring if we were going to make a long band of just the brown and the white sewn together. When we look at either a new quilt or an old quilt, quite often we want to decide what comprises the whole quilt. How is the block broken down? And I think if you will go to a corner of a quilt, I have 2 rulers here, and I think this will help you to understand. Always go to a corner of a quilt, and this, you can more or less see, that is how this particular quilt is broken down. She has 5 of these sections all the way across, and that's how she lap quilted it in those sections, and then all the way down would determine the length. And what's nice is once you have your block decided, measure your bed, and then you'll know the length of your bed and divide it by the size of your squares, and then measure not only the width but the length, and then you will determine how many of those squares you need to lap quilt to cover your entire bed. I think this is a lovely example of an intriguing 2-tone quilt, but definitely would have to be grafted out on paper to get the complete design. In talking about color, Connie Weeks from Winston-Salem has done a marvelous job of a whole medley of beautiful calicos that just kind of flow together, the accent color being the yellow all the way around the border. It really brings out the colors, doesn't it? Even the propeller of the little airplane. Her husband's a pilot, and isn't this nice? She made this for her son, Chris. She has alternated really sampler blocks with the airplane design also. If you'll look here in the center, we can see the Roman stripes, the square divided in 3 rectangles again. I think that's a charming quilt. One of the nice things about quilting I have found is that we can study all the guidelines and all the rules, and then we can go ahead and break all of them. Who would ever think of lavender and red put together in a Jacob's ladder block? But I think it's fun to experiment it. This is not paint by number or a kit sort of thing. We can really experiment and use different color combinations. Ruth Challand has made a lovely gray sampler quilt. It's a smaller, and I guess we could call this an Afghan size, couldn't we? Let's see how many the size we have here. We have 3 across and 4 over. These are 12 of our 18-inch squares put together. I think the touch of red is a nice accent color here. and she has a scroll design on the border. Some of the blocks, let's talk about. This is the Card Tricks design. There's your mini 9 patch. Here's your Jacob's Ladder again. But it has such a nice feeling and such a nice flow to it. If we look at the back of the quilt, we can see that she has created even more design on the back by alternating her stripe. It's awfully hard if we had all the stripes going in the same direction to exactly match them when they go together. So this way we can create design on the back side. Next time we're going to be talking about geometric shapes, and we're going to be turning to the sawtooth star, and I want to break this down from the very beginning and show you how to make templates. Then not only once the templates are made, but what happens after that, how they go onto the fabric, and some of the new tricks of the trade. We'll see you next time. Thank you for joining us.
Georgia Bonesteel is the author of the book Lap Quilting with Georgia Bonesteel, based on this television series.
At Home with Georgia is brought to you by Oxmoor House, publishers of Georgia Bonesteel's outstanding hardbound quilt books, which also serve as companion volumes to her public television series. To order these fine books on lap quilting, use the order form enclosed with this cassette, or write to Oxmoor House, Post Office Box 2463, Birmingham, Alabama, 35201.